veterans' benefits are delayed and disrupted. So, Madam President, as for this bill today, the Secretary has now acted. We all agree that its issues taken care of, but if my friend from Texas feels more comfort as a result of doing this, which I think is unnecessary, I don't object.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, if I can just respond very briefly, I appreciate the Majority Leader not objecting to consideration of this legislation. He believes that this issue had been resolved by this contractual arrangement between Fisher House and the Department of Defense, but ultimately the Department of Defense would have to reimburse Fisher House under what I understand the reported arrangement to be made. This obviates the need for any of that kind of workaround, together with any legal questions that might arise as to whether this is actually something the Department has the authority to do. I'm not suggesting they don't. I'm just saying this alleviates all those considerations. So I'm glad we were able to come together in a bipartisan way, like we were on the military pay for uniformed military, and pass this narrow piece of legislation. I think maybe now that we've passed the pay for active duty military and we've passed this provision that provides for survivor benefits for the families of the fallen, maybe that paves the way to open up for some other narrow bills until we can come together on a larger bill. As we've offered, for example, funding for NIH, National Institutes of Health, the distinguished assistant leader on the Democratic side gave a few days ago a very eloquent speech about children's cancer research. And under the bill that's passed by the House on a bipartisan basis that we would have called up here, that funding would be restored, as would funding for the Veterans Administration so they could process disability benefits, which they're not able to do now because of the cutoff in funding. So there's a number of areas where I think we can work together constructively if we will do so. And I'm just glad today that we were able to take care of this one.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
I'd be glad to yield the floor, or I'd yield for a question, whatever you wish.
Please just yield for a question through the chair. And I'd say through the chair, I think what we did here was the right thing to do. And I'm sorry, I am dreadfully sorry, that painfully sorry, that this government shutdown is hurting so many innocent people. It could come to an end with one decision by the Speaker to call one bill on the floor of the House. He refuses to do it. And so we are trying to put out these little fires, spare the American people of the pain and injustice that's coming about as a result of the shutdown. But I'd say to the Senator from Texas, even the Veterans Administration bill passed by the House fails to fund some critical areas for veterans. It does not fund the appeals process for veterans' disability claims. Those have stopped. Secondly, it doesn't fund the cemetery rights of veterans who are seeking to be buried in national cemeteries. So while we pay for funerals, the people who prepare the grave sites and such are not being paid. It doesn't have the Department of Labor program to hire unemployed veterans coming home. That's not funded. The HUD program for homeless veterans is not being funded. So the notion that we are somehow taking care of veterans with the House action is far from true. And the last point I'll make, over 500,000 federal employees are actually veterans. Many of them are furloughed today. A fourth of all the federal employee veterans are disabled. Many of them are furloughed today. So if we really, really care about veterans, opening the government to make sure all of these agencies are serving our veterans seems to me a reasonable approach. I ask the Senator if he agrees.
Madam President, responding to the question of the distinguished Assistant Majority Leader, I would say that we would all like to try to find some way to get back to business as usual when it comes to funding the government through the regular appropriations process. We haven't done that for a long time, and so we've been operating not on individual bills. I think there are 13 separate bills that as part of the appropriations process. So now we've unfortunately already degenerated to this continuing resolution process, which has got its own problems. But I would say to my friend that for every one of the hardships that we can mitigate through passing narrow legislation, absent a global agreement on the continuing resolution, it seems to me we ought to be doing that. And if there are other suggestions that the Democratic side has, about how we can do that, I think that would be a good thing to do. But there are a lot of them. The problem is, Madam President, I know the majority leader, maybe I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I hope he didn't really mean he thought this was a show process trying to restore these survivor benefits through this unanimous consent request. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do think there's a lot of questions raised in the minds of the American people whether what's happening here is being done purely for political purposes. When you have veterans, veterans of the World War II and Korea who come to the World War II memorial only to be met with barricades, and I've met a number of these honor flights of the greatest generation at a number of these memorials, and they basically decided to go around the barricades, as is their right, I believe, under the Constitution. But it just seems like there's an effort made to maximize the pain associated with the shutdown. We know 83% of the government's being funded. Why can't we try to chip away at some of these narrow provisions and mitigate some of the hardship that we can, rather than sort of getting in our corners and squaring off and creating more and more problems. So I think this is important. We ought to be doing this. We should have done this a long time ago. I would say to my colleagues, there are reports that Secretary Hagel notified the administration of this lapse in survivor benefits back before the shutdown even occurred. But it took the President 9 days before he finally ordered the Department of Defense to come up with a workaround, thankfully with the help of the Fisher House. So I think there's an impression here that a lot of gamesmanship is going on. I don't think it becomes the Senate. I think Congress's approval rating is in the toilet, and we ought to be doing everything we can to try to work together to try to address the problems where we can.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
Madam President, I'd yield the floor to the Senator.
Madam President.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
In response to the senior senator from Texas, let me make several points. First, I was at an honor flight at World War II Memorial last week with a great bunch of World War II veterans who came in from Illinois. And it didn't surprise me one bit. There was no barricade stopping these veterans. They were on their way to their memorial, and they went. The reason why there was any question about this memorial and access was because of the decision by the Republicans to shut down the government. I was going to remind the senator from Texas, who is a learned attorney and a former Texas Supreme Court justice, of the story we were told in law school. It was an anecdotal story, an apocryphal story of someone who killed both his parents and then went to the courtroom and threw himself on the mercy of the court because he was an orphan. In this situation, we have our Republican friends lamenting the impact of a government shutdown on World War II veterans coming to Washington, on these tragic stories of families that have lost someone they love in combat. All of this is unnecessary. All of it could have been avoided if the Republican Speaker of the House would call one bill for a vote which he knows will pass. It would open the government. That is a simple, honest answer. This notion that we're going to have a series of small appropriations to fund our government, all of the appropriation bills that have been called so far and passed the House amount to about 18% of the discretionary domestic budget. At this pace, the House only has to pass 79 more bills to open our government. We think at this pace it will only take them about 2.5 months to do it. Is that any way to run a great nation? It isn't. We need to open our government, serve our people, spare them the injustice and pain which comes from this Republican shutdown.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
My friend, the distinguished senior senator from Illinois, gave an example that applies to a number of things that my friend from Texas said. First of all, we haven't done appropriation bills. We haven't done appropriation bills because the Republicans won't let us. We can't even get cloture on a way to proceed to one of them. And then, Madam President, I want to make sure the record's clear. My friend from Texas doesn't have to give me the benefit of the doubt on what I said. If there were ever an example of this whole process being for show, it's this. We have a lot of things we should be working on. The country is within a week of defaulting on its debt for the first time in the history of this country. We should be focusing on that. The government should be open. And we had the unfortunate incident that brought this to the attention, and we had 5 of our troops killed over the weekend in Afghanistan. And it brought to the attention that they were not going to get their benefits because the government part that gives them the money is closed. We didn't close it. So Secretary Hagel, a former Republican member of this body, worked it out so that they are all taken care of. So they're all taken care of. So this unanimous consent request that I agreed to is for show. It doesn't mean anything. They're being taken care of anyway. So, no, I don't. I appreciate his giving you the benefit of the doubt, but he doesn't need to give me the benefit of the doubt. This whole thing is for show. This whole government shutdown is for show. The show, I don't quite understand the ending of it, but that's where we are.
The senator from Florida.
Inquire under the previous order how much time is remaining for the minority.
There's 8.5 minutes remaining for the Republicans.
So, Madam President, may I ask unanimous consent to add 5 minutes to that total for a total of 13?
Is there objection? Without objection.
Okay, thank you, Madam President. You know, with all this focus on going on in Washington these days, I think on the fighting that's going on in Washington these days, I think we're losing focus on the biggest issue that faces our country. And that's the pervasive and growing sense that we're losing control of our country, that we're losing the American dream. Now, why do people feel this way? Well, because millions of them have been out of a job for months and maybe even years. Because millions more find themselves stuck with jobs that don't pay enough for them to live on, or certainly for them to live like they used to. You know, when people hear the news that the economy is recovering, that unemployment is down by 0.1% this week or this month, that the stock market is up and that the recession is over, it makes people angry. And rightfully so, because the recession might be over on Wall Street, but it's not over for millions of people who are out of work or stuck with jobs that do not pay enough to live off. And you know what makes all of this worse? Is that while their paychecks aren't growing, their bills are growing. Ask the young couples out there and the single parents how much it's costing them every month or every week to provide child care for their kids. Ask the young Americans who are saddled with thousands of dollars in student loan debt. Now, how are people making it through? Well, I'm reminded of a few years after we got married, my wife and I hit a rough patch in our finances. And so what we did is we got rid of one of the cars and we moved in with her mom for 6 months. That's what many of us have had to do at some stage in our life, but it was usually temporary. But now people are doing that with the feeling that it might not be temporary, that this might be the way it is for a while. And they ask themselves, is this the new normal? Is this the way things are going to be from now on? This is what millions of people across this country are feeling these days. That maybe the American dream, that if you work hard you can improve your life, that maybe that dream isn't what it used to be. That maybe the American dream is actually even slipping away. Now, why is this happening? Whose fault is this, is the normal reaction that some people have? Well, there are a few reasons why this is happening. One is that the economy has changed. The nature of our economy has changed. Globalization, for example, has sent thousands of middle-class jobs overseas. Information technology and advances have replaced many of our middle-class jobs with machines. Another reason is why we have simply too many of our people never got the education or the skills they needed for the better-paying jobs that the new economy is creating. And we can't ignore, for example, the breakdown of our culture and our families and what it's doing. It's trapping people in a cycle of poverty and of dependence. These are all contributors to what we face today, but one of the major reasons why this is happening, why so many people are trapped in dead-end jobs, why so many people have been unemployed for so long, one of the major reasons why is because our economy is not creating enough jobs that you can live off. And one of the reasons why that's happening is because our country is headed for a debt crisis. The real debt crisis is not the dooming debt limit. The real debt crisis is that every year our government is spending more money than it takes in. And by the way, one day we're not going to have to worry about raising the debt limit because no one will want to lend us money anyways. Now, too often around here, we talk about the national debt as if it's simply an accounting problem. The national debt is a lot more than that. How does the economy create good jobs? It creates good jobs in two ways. Number one is through innovation, when people invent a new product or a new service. And the other is through investment, when people risk the money they have to start a new business, or when a business reinvests its profits back into the business to grow. But the fact that we are headed for a debt crisis and that we have no serious long-term plan in place to address it, that is discouraging innovation and that is discouraging investment. Who wants to innovate in an economy that's headed for a debt crisis? Who wants to risk their money to start a new business in an economy that's headed for a catastrophic disruption? And who wants to reinvest their profits to grow their business in a country where the government is going bankrupt? Having people trapped in low-paying jobs, having people unemployed for months or years at a time, having people unable to afford to get married or start a family, this doesn't have to be the new normal. It doesn't have to be this way forever. We can turn this around. But to do so, we have to stop chasing all these temporary gimmicks that promise us some sort of momentary boost to our economy. We have to stop ignoring the problems headed full speed at us. And we have to return to the basics that made us such a prosperous nation. Now, our national debt today, it stands at close to $17 trillion. In the last 5.5 years alone, it's grown by over $6 trillion. So when you hear the President or the Democrats here in the Senate say that they want us to pass what they call a clean debt limit increase, here's what they're really asking for. They are asking us to borrow another $1 trillion, but not do anything meaningful to slow the growth of that debt. Why would we continue to do this? When are we finally going to get serious around here about putting in place a serious long-term plan to bring this debt under control? In order to do that, the first thing we have to understand is what's causing this debt. Now look, we have a broken tax code. It's full of all sorts of special interest loopholes. But the reason why we have this massive debt isn't because rich people aren't paying enough in taxes. You know, even if we taxed every millionaire, every penny they made this year, it doesn't even make a small dent on the debt. Yes, there's some serious waste going on throughout our government. For example, we have to reverse the changes that the Obama administration has made to these welfare programs that basically gut the work requirement and leave people dependent on government. We need to reform the way we give foreign aid. We must and should do all of these things and even more. But even if we did all that, it's still not enough. What is driving our debt is the way we spend money on two very important programs, Medicare and Social Security. They are spending more money than they take in, and that gap is growing rapidly every single year. Now, I warn you, anytime anyone talks about making changes to these programs, you get accused of trying to hurt the elderly. So speaking for myself personally, let me set the record straight. I come from a state that has millions of people, millions of retirees that depend on these programs. One of them is my own mother. She worked hard for her entire life and paid into these programs so they would be there for her when she retired. I would never support any changes to these programs that hurt my mother. But these programs are going bankrupt. And anyone who's in favor of doing nothing about them is in favor of bankrupting them. And the good news is this. The good news is we still have time to save Medicare and Social Security. And we still have time to do these changes without making any changes to the benefits of seniors like my mom. But to do so is going to require younger workers like myself to accept that when we retire, our Medicare and our Social Security is going to be different than our parents'. So instead of spending all of our time around here trying to figure out how to raise the debt limit, we need to spend more of our time trying to figure out what we can do to put in place a serious long-term plan to bring this debt under control so that our economy can start creating more of those good-paying middle-class jobs, so that people can start building for themselves the better future they always dreamed of. The American dream is under assault. That is the real crisis. When are we going to get serious about solving it? You know, this dream of earning a better life, it's the universal hope of people everywhere. But we're reminded that for much of human history, most people found themselves trapped by the circumstances of their birth. That meant that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much talent you had, you're only going to go as far as your family went. You can only do whatever it is your parents did. But one of the things that's made America special is that here that's been different. Here, through hard work and sacrifice, people from all walks of life, from every corner of the world, have had the real opportunity to earn for themselves a better life. This is what we call the American dream. As Americans, that's our identity. It's what holds us together as a nation. It's what holds us together as a people. And it's what's made us exceptional. And so I know that people are discouraged about how tough times are. I know that some people are very disappointed about the way the last election turned out. I know many people are angry and, quite frankly, disgusted by the way this process is working or failing to work these days. But no matter how bad things may seem, we cannot give up on America. And we cannot give up on the American dream. We have to do everything we can to make sure that this country remains a place where anyone from anywhere can accomplish anything. And so despite how ugly Washington looks like right now, I actually remain confident that in the end that's exactly what we're going to do. And I have no doubt that in the end, our children will grow up to be the most prosperous generation that ever lived. And I know that despite all the challenges we face right now, when all is said and done, I believe with all my heart that we will still go down in history as the generation that saved the American dream and that left for our children what our parents left for us, the single greatest nation in the history of the world. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Florida.
Madam President, I'm mindful of the hour as the Senate is about to recess. And I just want to say to my colleague from Florida, who is my friend, that I have optimism and I have that faith in our country as well. And I think it's interesting that the stock market, the Dow Jones, has surged 243 points. I just checked it a couple of minutes ago on just the rumors that the debt ceiling will be lifted and we will not go through this crisis. But I'm told at the other end of the Capitol, the House of Representatives stop the shutdown of the government and pass a continuing appropriations bill. And so here we are, back in the soup again. And if we do just a short-term debt extension, debt ceiling lifting, then for however long it is, 5-6 weeks, then come Thanksgiving, we're going to be back in the soup again. There's got to be a change in attitude. And the attitude has got to be, I respect the other fellow's point of view. I respect his difference of opinion. Now let's work it out together. And it's only until then is when we're going to solve this problem. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
And as you heard, the Senate is now in recess, subject to the call of the chair. They'll be back sometime this afternoon. Just a short time ago, senators passed by unanimous consent the bill funding military death benefits that the House passed yesterday, 425-0. It now goes to the President for his signature. When lawmakers return, we expect more debate on the government shutdown and the debt ceiling. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2. Now, many of you are using social media to offer reaction to the House and Senate impasse over the government shutdown. Anytime you want, tweets, Congress is going to keep their priority on political games instead of national security.